probably know, I'm still kind of settling into my new routine, given that I'm working now at a warehouse. And I am very happy that I have this job, of course, but it is taking some getting used to, as my sleep schedule has changed from going to bed quite early at 9:30 to going to bed at around 12. Currently my hours are every day. I work 3 p.m. till 10:30 p.m. And it's been quite a good thing. And of course I've had heaps of other stuff to do. I'm currently registering to change university courses. But this is always at the back of my mind. I'm always thinking about making ASMR and the channel because, I mean, really it's my main passion. Like in life, most likely, I can't think of anything I'm more passionate about besides philosophy and stoicism. This is my thing. So it pains me when I can't do it for a prolonged period of time. So, here we are again. And today we are whispering about vampires. So, of course, strap in and get ready for another Whispering Wikipedia. If you have something you want me to whisper about, please leave it in the comments below. I check and read every comment. I've read every comment on the channel, but in the last few days I haven't been able to respond. But I think tomorrow morning I'm going to make some solid time to respond to a lot of comments. But yeah, so please leave me a comment. I love hearing from all of you. Without further ado, vampire. A vampire is a creature from folklore that subsists by feeding on the vital essence, generally in the form of blood, of the living. In European folklore, vampires are undead creatures that often visited loved ones and caused mischief or deaths in the neighborhoods they inhabited while they were alive. They were shrouds and were often described as bloated and of ruddy or dark countenance, markedly different from today's gaunt, pale vampire, which dates from the early 19th century. Vampiric entities have been recorded in most cultures. The term vampire was popularized in Western Europe after reports of an 18th century mass hysteria of a pre-existing folk belief in the Balkans and Eastern Europe that in some cases resulted in corpses being staked and people being accused of vampirism. Local variants in Eastern Europe were also known by different names, such as Shtrigra in Albania, Vrikolakas in Greece, and Strigoi in Romania. In modern times, the vampire is generally held to be a fictitious entity, although belief in similar vampiric creatures such as the chupacabra still persists in some cultures. Early folk belief in vampires has sometimes been ascribed to the ignorance of the body's process of decomposition after death and how people in pre-industrial societies tried to rationalize this, creating the figure of the vampire to explain the mysteries of death. Porphyria was linked with legends of vampirism in 1985 and received much media exposure but has since been largely discredited. Interesting, I wonder what that is. The charismatic and sophisticated vampire of modern fiction was born in 1819 with the publication of The Vampire by the English writer John Polidori. The story was highly successful and arguably influential vampire work of the early 19th century. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula is remembered as the quintessential vampire novel and provided the basis of the modern vampire legend, even though it was published after Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novel Carmilla. The success of this book spawned a distinctive vampire genre, still popular in the 21st century with books, films, television shows, and video games. The vampire has since become a dominant figure in the horror genre. Well, of course, that is definitely true. Of course, we can't read Wikipedia without the section on etymology. The Oxford English Dictionary dates the first appearance of the word vampire as vampire with a Y instead of an I in English from 1734 in a travelogue titled Travels of Three English Gentlemen, published in the Harleian Miscellany in 1745. Vampires had already been discussed in French and German literature after Austria gained control of northern Serbia and Oltenia with the Treaty of Passarowitz. In 1718, officials noted the local practice of exhuming bodies and killing vampires. These reports, prepared between 1725 and 1732, received widespread publicity. The English term was derived, possibly via the French vampire, from the German Vampir, in turn derived in the early 18th century from the Serbian of vampir, which in Serbian Cyrillic is vampir. I think I am still fairly terrible at reading Cyrillic-based alphabets, but whatever. The Serbian form has parallels in virtually all Slavic languages, Bulgarian and Macedonian. I don't see any difference. Bosnian is vampir, Croatian is also vampir, Czech and Slovak are vampir or upir, Polish is urebrio, and perhaps the East Slavic influenced. I can't say the Ukrainian. Russian seems like upir, Belarusian upir. This is getting to a territory where I have no really phonetic understanding of how to say some of these words. I've only ever learned introductory Russian, so this is kind of out of my depth. Anyway, but it says, basically, to summarize, it gives a list of the different ways vampire is pronounced, and it's pronounced very similarly all over common, Slavic and Cyrillic-based languages. Many of these have borrowed forms such as vampire, wampir, subsequently from the West. These are distinct from the original local words of the creature. The exact etymology is unclear. Among the proposed Proto-Slavic forms are two which I cannot pronounce, but they are different. Another less widespread theory is that the Slavic languages have borrowed the word from a Turkic term for witch, which is takar. Czech linguist Václav Maček proposes Slovak verb vrpit sa, stick to, thrust into, or its hypothetical anagram vrpit sa. In Czech, the archaic verb vperit means to thrust violently, as an etymological background, and thus translate to upir as someone who thrusts, bites. An early use of the Old Russian word is the anti-pagan treatise Word of Saint Gregory think for a historian or someone that's interested in the more kind of philosophical or metaphysical, kind of meanings behind things, there's an interest in etymology because of its link to what it means. Like the shared human experience, stuff like how onomatopoeia seems to universally pop up throughout different languages. That's why one of the reasons why I find it important to remind myself to read etymology, even when sometimes it can be a little bit boring. Anyway, now we move to folk beliefs. The notion of vampirism has existed for millennia. Cultures such as the Mesopotamians, the Hebrews, the ancient Greeks, the Manipuri, and the Romans all had tales of demons and spirits which are considered precursors to the modern vampires. Despite the occurrence of vampiric creatures in the ancient civilizations, the folklore for the entity known today as the vampire originates almost exclusively from the early 18th century southeastern Europe, when verbal traditions of many ethnic groups of the region were recorded and published. In most cases, vampires are revenants of evil beings, suicide victims, or witches, but they can also be created by a malevolent spirit possessing a corpse or being bitten by a vampire. Belief in such legends became so pervasive that in some areas it caused mass hysteria and even public executions of people believed to be vampires. It sounds a little bit like the Great Witch Hunt era, if you remember me reading about that from the Wikipedia. Maybe that's something that I should read about in the future, the Great Witch Hunt or Purge era of history. Now, let's talk about their description and common attributes. It is difficult to make a single definitive description of the folkloric vampire. I know that's true, though there are several elements common to many European legends. Vampires were usually reported as bloated in appearance and reddish, purplish, or dark in colour. These characteristics were often attributed to the recent drinking of blood. Blood was often seen seeping from the mouth and nose when one was seen in its shroud or coffin, and its left eye was open. Interesting. It would be clad in the linen shroud it was buried in, and its teeth, hair, and nails may have grown somewhat, though in general fangs were not a feature. Although vampires were generally described as undead, some folktales spoke of them as living beings. Now let's move to creating vampires. The causes of vampiric generation were many and varied in original folklore. In Slavic and Chinese traditions, any corpse that was jumped over by an animal, particularly a dog or a cat, was feared to become one of the undead. What a seemingly random superstition. It's always funny when you hear about things like that to try and hear about what the logical idea behind it is. If you have seen The Holy Grail, there's a rather funny scene where they try and explain the logic behind how they can use science to find out if this woman is a witch or not. If you get my reference, you'll know what I'm saying. But it's funny to see people try and logically give evidence about something before having a grounding in what the idea of evidence is. Anyway, a body with a wound that had not been treated with boiling water was also at risk practices often arose that were intended to prevent a recently deceased loved one from turning into an undead revenant. I know that's true, especially given the belief in many European countries that a baby that was born and died without, a proper burial and everything could end up haunting and trying to kill the mother or father. That's probably another Wikipedia, which would be great to read. Anyway, burying a corpse upside down was widespread, as was placing earthly objects such as scythes or sickles near the grave to satisfy any demons entering the body or to appease the dead so that it would not wish to arise from its coffin. This method resembles the ancient Greeks' practice of placing an obelisk in the corpse's mouth to pay the toll to cross the river Styx in the underworld. It has been argued that instead the coin was intended to ward off any evil spirits from entering the body, and this may have influenced later vampire folklore. This tradition persisted in modern Greek folklore about the Vikolakos, in which a wax cross and piece of pottery with the inscription "Jesus Christ conquers" were placed on the corpse to prevent the body from becoming a vampire. Very interesting. Other methods commonly practiced in Europe included severing the tendons at the knees, or placing poppy seeds, millet or sand on the ground at the grave site of a presumed vampire. This was intended to keep the vampire occupied all night by counting the fallen grains. I have heard that one before, indicating an association of vampires with arithmomania. Arithmomania. Interesting. I wonder what arithmomania is. From the name, it indicates kind of an obsession with arithmetics or with arithmetic. That's an interesting one as well. I know, of course, the classic use of salt at the door or salt around your summoning circle to be likely, I think the logic behind that is that for some reason they think that the demon has to count each grain before it goes to the other side. I have no idea why that's a rule, but apparently it's a widespread belief. Anyway, similar Chinese narratives state that if a vampiric being came across a sack of rice, it would have to count every single grain. This is a theme encountered in myths from the Indian subcontinent as well as in South American tales of witches and other sorts of evil or mischievous spirits or beings. Interesting. I wonder why that is so pervasive. It seems to be really widespread in China, South America, and the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, all of the countries around there. That's a lot of the globe. In Albanian folklore, the Dampir is the hybrid child of a Karkanoxel, a lycanthropic creature with an iron male shirt, or the Lugat, a water-dwelling ghost or monster. The Dampir, sprung of a Karkanoxel, has the unique ability to discern the Karkanoxel. From this derives the expression the Dampir knows the Lugat. The Lugat cannot be seen, he can only be killed by the Dampir, who himself is usually the son of a Lugat. In different regions, animals can be revenants as Lugats, also living people during their sleep. And Dampiraj is also an Albanian surname. Interesting. Now, how do you identify vampires? Well, many rituals were used to identify a vampire. One method of finding a vampire's grave involved leading a restricting you or someone is nearby and you can't move. It's quite a terrifying feeling sometimes. Anyway, we move now to protection. Apotropaics, which are items able to ward off revenants, are common in vampire folklore. Of course, you've probably seen if you've encountered any vampire literature. Garlic is a common example. A branch of wild rose and hawthorn are said to harm vampires, and in Europe, sprinkling mustard seeds on the roof of a house was said to keep them away. Other apotropaics include sacred items, for example, a crucifix, rosary, or holy water. Vampires are said to be unable to walk on consecrated ground, such as that of churches or temples, or cross running water. Now, I don't know why running water is considered consecrated ground. It's very interesting to me. I think that's something that I need to do further research into, because I still don't necessarily understand that. I know the common belief that a vampire can't, cross running water, but I'm not sure why. That's neither here nor there. Let's continue. Although not traditionally regarded as an apotropaic, mirrors have been used to ward off vampires. When placed facing outwards on a door, in some cultures, vampires do not have a reflection, and sometimes do not cast a shadow, perhaps as a manifestation of the vampire's lack of a soul. That's interesting. Interesting that the show of yourself in a mirror can be representative of your soul. Kind of like when you look at a mirror, you're also perceiving your soul, perhaps. I wonder what that means. There's probably a deeper dualistic meaning behind it. Of course, as you'll know, some cultures don't like to be photographed. Indigenous Australians don't like to be photographed if they are, of course, a member and believe their cultural or religion, because they believe that it captures a part of their soul and it's unnatural, something like that. So maybe there is something about a representation of someone that is not physically them, that represents a part of the soul which is intangible, like seeing yourself in a reflection or having an image recorded of you. I'll have to think about that. Let's continue. This attribute is not universal. The Greeks were capable of both reflection and shadow, but it was used by Bram Stoker in Dracula and has remained popular with subsequent authors and filmmakers. Some traditions also hold that a vampire cannot enter a house unless invited by the owner. After the first invitation, they can come and go as they please. Though folkloric vampires were believed to be more active at night, they were not generally considered vulnerable to sunlight. Interesting. Methods of destruction. Some of these will be probably familiar to you. Methods of destroying suspected vampires varied, with staking the most commonly cited method, particularly in southern Slavic cultures. Ash was the preferred wood in Russia and the Baltic states, or hawthorn in Serbia, with a record of oak in Cilicia. Aspen was also used for stakes, as it was believed that Christ's cross was made from aspen. Aspen branches on the graves of purported vampires were also believed to prevent their risings at night. Potential vampires were most often staked through the heart. similar to a practice of anti-vampire burial, burying sharp objects such as sickles with the corpse so that they may penetrate the skin if the body bloats sufficiently while transforming into a revenant. Decapitation was the preferred method in German and Western Slavic areas, with the head buried between the feet, behind the buttocks, or away from the body. This act was seen as a way of hastening the departure of the soul, which in some cultures was said to linger in the corpse. The vampire's head, body, or clothes could also be spiked and pinned to the earth to prevent rising. Romani people drove steel or iron needles into a corpse's heart and placed bits of steel in the mouth, over the eyes, ears, and between the fingers at the time of burial. They also placed hawthorn in the corpse's sock or drove a hawthorn stake through the legs. In a 16th century burial near Venice, a brick forced into the mouth of a female corpse has been interpreted as a vampire slaying ritual by the archaeologists who discovered it in 2006. In Bulgaria, over 100 skeletons with metal objects such as plough bits embedded in the torso have been discovered. Further beliefs included pouring boiling water over the grave or complete incineration of the body. In the Balkans, a vampire could also be killed by being shot or drowned, by repeating the funeral service, by sprinkling holy water on the body, or by exorcism. In Romania, garlic could be placed in the mouth, and as recently as the 19th century, the precaution of shooting a bullet through the coffin was taken. For resistant cases, the body was dismembered and the pieces burned, mixed with water and administered to family members as a cure. In Saxon regions of Germany, a lemon was placed in the mouth of suspected vampires. Okay. Now we move to ancient beliefs. Tales of supernatural beings consuming the blood or flesh of the living has been found in nearly every culture around the world for many centuries. The term vampire did not exist in ancient times. Blood drinking and similar activities were attributed to demons or spirits who would eat flesh and drink blood. Even the devil was considered synonymous with the vampire. Almost every nation has associated blood drinking with some kind of revenant or demon, or in some cases a deity. In India, for example, tales of Vitalis, ghoulish beings that inhabit corpses, have been compiled in the Baite Baisisi, a prominent story in the Katha Sadik Sagra, tells of King Vikramaditya and his nightly quests to capture an elusive one. Pisaka, the returned spirits of evildoers or those who died insane, also bear vampiric attributes. The Persians were one of the first civilizations to have tales of blood-drinking demons. Creatures attempting to drink blood from men were depicted on excavated pottery shards. Ancient Babylonia and Assyria had tales of the mythical Lilitu, synonymous with and giving rise to Lilith, and her daughters from Lilu, from Hebrew demonology. Lilitu was considered a demon and was often depicted as subsisting on the blood of babies and estries. Female shape-shifting, blood-drinking demons were said to roam the night among the population, seeking victims. According to Sefer Hasidim, estries were creatures created in the twilight hours before God rested. as having the bodies of crows or birds in general, and were later incorporated into Roman mythology as Strix, a kind of nocturnal bird that fed on human flesh and blood. That seems an adequately disturbing place to end this episode, and thank you so much for joining me. I'm actually having a lot of fun learning about vampires. I love seeing the spread and difference of ideas throughout different cultures, and it's super interesting seeing the rather messed up origins of a lot of stories and ideas which have kind of been evolved over time to be more suitable for a larger audience. You know, if you think about the original undead version of a vampire that is sleeping in its coffin with its burial clothes and eating flesh, to a now kind of, cartoonicized version where they have these big fangs and, in Twilight they're romantic figures and they're not as ghoulish